1. So thank you. This is Brene Lloyd from Northwatch, and thank you everyone for joining us for the Wednesday, February 18th webinar on nuclear risk. And our presenter today is Shawn-Patrick Stensil. He's an analyst with Greenpeace Canada and with Greenpeace International, and has become really an expert in analyzing the risk assessments and the risk statements put forward by proponents, the nuclear industry, primarily in licensing exercises. So we're very fortunate to have Shawn-Patrick fresh back to the country and ready to share with us today his presentation, Nuclear Risk, Calculating the Incredible. So thank you, Shawn-Patrick. Go ahead.
Great. And just to confirm, Brene, how do I change slides?
At the bottom of your screen, you should see a bar that says slide 3 out of 27. Next. Do you see that?
No.
To the bottom of your screen. Perhaps you entered as a participant, not as a presenter. Let me correct that. I can. All right. I've just promoted you as presenter, so you should in a moment see that menu here below.
Okay.
See it?
No. Can you change slides in the interim?
I can.
Okay. So what we'll do is we'll have a nice back and forth. Thanks, Brene. And yeah, when Brene, first of all, most of this presentation today will be focused on reactor risks, so less on the radioactive waste side of things. But I want to give you some background from me. Brene said I'd become, quote unquote, an expert on nuclear risks, but I started working on nuclear issues about 15 years ago now, and had to try and decipher when the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission said everything was safe, everything was reasonable, what they meant by that. Because in my view, and I think many people on the phone, I had disagreed with them. And what's really going on is we're using the same words quite differently. And what I want to convey to you in this presentation today is one, to understand how the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and the operators are using words like risk and safety, and hopefully that will give you an ability to ask the right questions in different fora to challenge their assumptions, whether it's on reactor relicensing or regarding radioactive waste projects in your own community. The next slide, Brene. And, you know, first of all, a big part of the debate, on one side of it, you will have, and this is the framing that's often put to you in the media, is you'll have the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the Nuclear Waste Management Organization, and reactor operators. And they all have a number of pointy-headed PhDs and engineers that work for them. And they will be viewed or perceived and present themselves as objective, analytical, scientific, and based on data. So rational. And this is viewed with a lot of value in our society. On the other side of things, though, the public in the nuclear debate tends to be portrayed as being subjective, emotional, intuitive, and irrational. And so this debate often gets quite polarized. One thing that I think will come out in my presentation today is what we find is experts aren't quite, or in this industry, aren't always objective, and they can be quite emotional, actually, and have their own blind spots regarding the risks, their portrayal of the risks, and their analysis of the risk. And the public in the past 2 years, we saw with Fukushima, a lot of the public concerns have been vindicated. Things that were said or claimed to be impossible have actually happened. So it's very important to be challenging some of these assumptions that are coming out of the NW and the CNSC. So understanding this frame is important, because what will happen often is public interventions will try to be, again, portrayed or cornered as emotional and non-analytical. And there's some ways to get around that I'll talk to you about. Next slide, Renee. So today, the agenda is 4 questions I'll try to respond to. What does the industry and the CNSC mean, and the NWMO, when they claim that nuclear power is safe or a radioactive waste facility, for example, is safe? So what does the word safety mean? And how do all of these, the NWMO, the CNSC, and operators, justify ignoring the impacts of accidents? One key concern of the public is what happens in the event of an accident at any of these facilities. And what often happens, or always happens, in licensing processes, as well as environmental assessments, is the environmental impacts and effects that the public is concerned by are excluded from those reviews. And they justify that in a way that I'll discuss. Finally, what are the flaws in CNSC's approach to risk and the NWMO's approach to risk, and how to respond? So what's a way to start creating debate in this area if you're intervening in any process? So first of all, good timing, Brene. Let's start with what the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission is required to do. It's important to understand that the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has a legislative mandate, and that's what makes them tick. So if you're trying to understand what they're doing or persuade them about something, it's important to put it in words that they understand and that they're theoretically being accountable for. And on slide, I've put one of the main sections of, or the objective sections of the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. And it says the Act, or the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's mandate, is to limit, quote, to a reasonable level, the risks of nuclear power to the public, as well as to provide objective information. So that phrasing of reasonable level of risk is important, because when they use the word safety, what they really mean is they've determined that an installation, radioactive waste, or a reactor only poses a reasonable level of risk to the public. So that is, it's not without any risk, but they view that risk to be acceptable. And that's based on an analysis that they've done. So it's really important to understand what's the foundation of how they develop this concept of what is reasonable risk. Next slide, please. And this concept of reasonable risk goes back decades. And I would put to you has actually become a bit of a myth, or is a belief, at this point now, a belief system. So back in the 1950s, Canada started developing nuclear power. After World War II, we were one of the countries that had nuclear technology, and the Canadian government wanted to be a player, along with the United States and the United Kingdom, in developing reactors. And to do that, as many of you know, they put a lot of money into Atomic Energy of Canada to design and promote the production and development of CANDU reactors. And that, of course, has also led to the development of radioactive waste. And in the 1950s, there was no empirical data for them to say whether a reactor would be safe or not. But what they knew is they had a technology that was created as the atomic bomb. They could use it to boil water, and if they could do that, they could produce electricity, and that would have benefits for society. But on the other side, because they were using technology that was based on the atomic bomb technology, it came with risks. And so in the 1950s, they started talking about, like, what are these risks? How should we regulate them? What will it take for private industry to take over these types of risks and promote them? And on screen, you see an extract from a memo that went to the federal cabinet in the era of Diefenbaker. When the government was looking at developing, we have something called the Nuclear Liability and Compensation Act now, and that act limits the liability of reactor operators. But it was created in the 1950s because private industry was unwilling to take on the full risk of developing reactors. Private companies such as General Electric said, if you want us to develop this technology, we want to be protected from the liability because there is no empirical track record. And our private investors won't stand for that. And so internally, the federal government said, all right, if we're going to do that, what would be the risk or the likelihood that the federal government may have to pay for such an accident? And as you can see in an internal memo, they say experts do not agree on the likelihood of an accident like Fukushima or Chernobyl, what we've seen, but they've estimated the possibility of such an accident happening as being 1 in 100,000 to 1 in a billion years of reactor operation. So that's those numbers may seem a little mind-blowing. 100,000 years, I think, is longer than the human race has been around. In 1 billion, maybe the planet. But those were the estimates that the government came to. And amazingly, 50 years later, they're using those same numbers. So they're very important to understand. And the government said, well, we see this as being a reasonable risk to take for the federal government to assume. And so these numbers, 1 in 100,000 years of reactor operation, we of course have never operated a reactor that long, and couldn't. That became the basis for regulation. We're going to see it over and over again. And the notation that I have in the corner of the 10e to the 5 RY, that is 1 every 100,000 years of reactor operation. That is the basic rule of thumb that reactor operators use. But this is the basic belief system that I call it a belief system that underpins nuclear regulation. Next slide, please. So on screen, this may be difficult to understand, but those probabilities that I talked about, if you look in the row called classification frequency, this is using those reactor years of operation where the CNSC defines what accidents reactor operators should plan for. And you see the column called design, DBA, that stands for design basis accident, and it's 10 to the 2 to 10 to the 5. That's the number you saw on the last slide. So that's 1 in 100,000 years of reactor operation. Those are accidents that the regulator says reactor operators have to plan for, that they have to make their plants designed to withstand, to protect the public. Above that, so less than 1 e to the 5, that's when they get into accidents that they call severe accidents, which we would call 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, or Fukushima. So they've always viewed those types of accidents as being extremely low probability. So you start to see this cutoff line where they've built regulation around these risk numbers. And again, that's based on, in their view, 1 in 100,000 years is a reasonable risk to take under the Act. Next slide. So this slide, using the title of this presentation is Calculating the Incredible, and I've put down kind of the threshold or cutoff where the CNSC claims accidents are credible or incredible. And that is 1 e to the 6 that they've used. So that's 1 in a million years of reactor operation. So they view everything from an accident once every 100 years to once in a million years as quote unquote credible. These are accidents that we should plan for, but it's also accidents where we'll look at the environmental effects. And everything below that, 1 in a million years to 1 in 10 billion years, they call incredible. So accidents that we don't really need to look at because they're of such a low likelihood. And below that timeline or probability line that I have on screen, you'll see an extract from an environmental assessment that was done on the Darlington Nuclear Station. And basically there they say, we don't need to look at accidents that are incredible. We don't need to look at those environmental effects because there's such a low likelihood. And this, when you're in licensing hearings or in environmental assessments, is where a lot of the conflict happens. because members of the public are interested in what those environmental effects would be, what the emergency measures are that would protect the public, what the social effects would be, whether that's socially acceptable. But the regulator just says, well, we view that in our mathematical calculations as being so low of a probability, we don't need to look at it. In reactor operation, we don't expect accidents to happen up to 1 in a million years of reactor operation. That's a reasonable thing to do. It's not an unreasonable risk. And that's really where the conflict is. Next slide. So this slide is just simple core metrics, or CNSC metrics, of how they define risk. One is something called core damage frequency. So 1 in 10,000 years of reactor operation, 1e to the 4, is the limit that the CNSC puts on core damage frequency. What is core damage frequency? Well, that's a 3 Mile Island type accident. It's an accident where there's the reactor fuel melts, but there isn't necessarily a large release to the environment because the containment of the reactor would hold that in and protect the public. So that's about 1 in 10,000 years is the limit they put on reactor operators for that. That's like a 3 Mile Island accident that we saw in 1979. So note that even while it says 1 in 10,000 years of reactor operation, this has already happened in the 1970s. The other main metric is what they call large release frequency. And that is an accident where a large amount of radioactivity is released into the environment and will cause off-site effects. The limit that they put on that is 1 in 100,000 years of reactor operation, or 1e to the 5. And these two metrics underpin most of nuclear licensing and reactor licensing. So when they say at a relicensing hearing, it's reasonable to go ahead with this relicensing and give them a new hearing, it's because the operator has said, we have shown that core damage accidents and large release accidents would be less than 1e to the 4, or 1 in 110,000 years for core damage, or 1 in 100,000 years for large release frequency. That's really what they mean. Next slide. So what's really incredible is this whole approach is used to justify excluding key aspects of public concern from debate and depriving the public of certain forms of information because that information is just deemed as something we don't need to look at because it's a low probability. And here's some examples. The CNSC and reactor operators historically have not had to look at the effects of a major accident like Chernobyl or Fukushima. In environmental assessments, they've just deemed it as being too low. Same in licensing. So we've never had a public study of the impacts of a Fukushima or Chernobyl scale accident in Canada, ever, despite 50 years. And that's because they've said it's of a low probability. And a few years ago, some of you on the phone may have intervened in hearings on the environmental review of the proposal to extend the life of the Darlington reactors. This was a big issue at those hearings, and hundreds of people wrote letters to the commission saying, Fukushima just happened. It's completely unacceptable that you haven't considered what the effects are of a major accident, because we've been seeing them worldwide about once a decade, and what the impacts on emergency planning would be. But again, they use these probabilities to justify simply ignoring these types of consequences. A second major issue is Ontario, which is responsible for preparing off-site emergency measures, doesn't prepare off-site measures to protect the public for large radioactive releases. It has a 10-kilometer evacuation zone around the plants. There are some public alerting facilities around the plants, but those have been established to deal with only small-scale accidents. They haven't designed these measures to deal with a Fukushima scale accident or large radioactive releases. And that is because when they developed these plans, they were again told by the CNSC, Ontario Power Generation, that such large releases were incredible. and of the low probability. And this is something that Greenpeace and Canadian Environmental Law Association, as well as Durham Nuclear Awareness right now, are working on in the Toronto area and around the Bruce, because these plans should really be updated in light of Fukushima. And some other countries, such as Switzerland, have upgraded, have kind of thrown out this traditional approach to safety assessment and said, even if the risk assessments the industry provides say these are low probability, we need to look at these large releases because they're happening. The other issue is what I mentioned earlier. The federal government exempts the industry from liability, and part of the justification for that is the federal government says, well, the industry doesn't want to assume the liability, but when we look at the probability and our experts look at the probability, such accidents are really low and unlikely. Therefore, we're willing to assume the liability and put it on the tax base to promote this industry. Again, this is based on their likelihood estimates for accidents, and it dates back. They've been using the same numbers since the 1950s, even in spite of empirical evidence. And finally, I think this is a big one. The public debate on energy choices is skewed. We don't have a public discussion on the social susceptibility of reactor hazards, because the information on off-site consequences of major accidents were not given. The CNSC doesn't produce those studies. So in the debate on, for example, wind or nuclear in Ontario, we hear lots from the anti-wind crowd about effects and the demanding of studies, et cetera, et cetera. But even though we've seen 3 major accidents worldwide, we've never had information on what such accidents would look like in Ontario and whether that's socially acceptable. So these are all impacts on how the CNSC's approach to risk assessment. And note, all the things on screen are issues that the public often raises in licensing and environmental assessments. And when they raise them, they're told, often, I know I was quite confused 10 years ago. I would raise these issues at the CNSC and be told, we don't need to look at that. And the reasoning for it is all this probabilistic risk assessment approach that I've been discussing with you. Next slide. How does this apply to radioactive waste management? I know a lot of you on the call are interested in that, and something that Northwatch works on a lot. Well, I know this area less, but there is a very good parallel in that they also use a probabilistic approach for the safety assessment for radioactive waste management. And on screen, you see a screenshot of G320. This is the CNSC regulatory guide for assessing long-term safety of radioactive waste facilities. If you look in that guide, they again talk about the use of a probabilistic approach to exclude certain scenarios of impact for radioactive waste facilities. And they often use a phrase that you'll see called bounding assessment or a bounding approach. What is a bounding approach? Well, it's exactly what I've just been talking to you about. The regulator and the industry will just choose a likelihood. So for reactors, it's 1e to the 6 or 1 in a million years that they use as a cutoff. So anything, less than 1 in a million years, so 1 in a billion years, for example, they don't look at the consequences of those types of events. So when how is this impacted licensing? Well, the NWMO, on screen, you'll see their most recent pre-project report, and you can see in it they talk about bounding assessments. So the NWMO has been doing studies on the impacts of a fuel waste facility, but those assessments are based on a bounding assessment. So they're excluding certain scenarios from their assessment. So what I would suggest to people on the phone, I don't have the details with me now, but when you're asking questions of the NWMO, look into the details of where they're putting what justification they're using for this bounding assessment. Because that's where you'll start to understand what's being included in the assessment and what's being excluded. Next slide. So how is this approach flawed? I've hinted at this a little bit, and I'm going to now discuss some major flaws for the reactor assessments that I've talked about and I have the most experience with, but I think a lot of those are also applicable to radioactive waste risk approach as well. So the first one is, as I mentioned off the top, the probabilities used by the industry and government date back from the 1950s, where they said 1 in a million years of reactor operation, you might see a reactor meltdown. Well, what's actually happened? We have about 440 reactors worldwide, and if you were to multiply that by the number of reactors operating and using this 1 in a million, it means that you should probably see a major accident about once every 250 years because there's 440 reactors operating. In reality, what we've been seeing is a reactor accident somewhere in the world about once a decade. We've seen 3 Mile Island, which is the core melt accident, but we've also seen Chernobyl and Fukushima, which were large release accidents. All of these accidents were said to be of such a low probability they never needed to be discussed. So the conclusion I would put to you is this probability theory that is used and underpins reactor licensing is also unsafe because it's not playing out through empirical evidence. Next slide. And what are the exact learnings from Fukushima? On screen is a report that Greenpeace International put out in 2012, where we contracted a number of people to look at the Fukushima disaster and note what the lessons are. And one of the top line observations is the empirical probability of meltdown or major accidents has been about once a decade somewhere in the world. That's very different from the theory that we've been told. Second, what's been the cause of all these accidents? And this is where we start to see where the technical experts have a blind spot. Well, we've been told, or it's portrayed that Fukushima was caused by a tsunami and earthquake. What actually happened was the regulator and the operator were aware of the tsunami risk. They should have upgraded the station, but they just dismissed the tsunami risk and said, these reactors are safe, it's such a low probability. They didn't bother upgrading the station. There was what's often called institution or regulatory failure. That is a failure of institutions that have been entrusted with protecting the public to actually take their responsibilities seriously and regulate. And that didn't happen with Fukushima, but it's also a leading cause of Chernobyl and of 3 Mile Island. Humans and institutions were causes of the accident. These contributors to risk are not included within typical risk assessment that's done by the CNSC. I've been asking them to do that, and it hasn't happened. And the third piece is that when you exempt an industry from the responsibility for the risk it creates, they'll take risky behavior. They'll act out in a risky way. So the industry is protected through the Nuclear Liability Act. So they have no check. They know if they fail or they do something bad, they won't actually have to pay for it. So these lessons are important because those concepts of institutional failure and regulatory capture aren't considered within current risk models. Next slide. And on screen, there's that line, probability line that I put up earlier. So excuse my bad graphic design skills. But you see the 1e to the 6 in the middle. I have goal for new reactors. That was the dividing line between incredible and credible accidents. What you see on screen is I've compared it to the actual occurrence of major reactors worldwide. That's the first arrow at the top on your left. So the observed frequency we've seen worldwide is accidents are happening about between somewhere every 1,000 and 10,000 years of reactor operation. That's about 2 orders of magnitude greater than we've been told. That's a reality check. The other is the assessment of the industry's insurers. I've FOI'd, done Freedom of Information requests to Ontario Power Generation for their insurance premiums and had some people analyze that. And according to their insurers, OPG's insurers, assume that major accidents would happen at about the same frequency that we've been seeing worldwide. So that's an independent assessment by OPG's insurers. So this is a reality check. While we're told through licensing that it's a low probability, we're both seeing these accidents happen regularly, and the insurance industry assumes it's happening at about the same level. So not very reassuring. Next slide. And finally, this issue of risk assessment has been acknowledged to some degree post-Fukushima that current risk models aren't adequate, but we haven't seen a lot of action on it. On screen, there's a quote from the former head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the United States, and I've seen him speak before, and he was very critical before he had to resign from the NRC of risk assessment methods. And what he says is, or has said, is if the industry needs to update its risk models to take into account the public's concerns about risk and their metrics about risk. Because frankly, Fukushima, according to the industry's risk models, would be viewed as an acceptable event. I won't get too much into the details, but effectively, no one died immediately, and they were able to evacuate the areas around the reactor, even though there was a large release. That would say, according to industry, makes it acceptable in certain ways. But of course, the public has viewed that very differently in Japan. And that's because the public is looking at the environmental impacts, the social dislocation. All of those issues aren't integrated into current risk models. Next slide. And finally, the risk assessments I've been talking about are based on a risk assessment of one reactor at a time. A big issue in Ontario is that we've built our reactors at multi-unit sites. So we have up to 8 reactors operating at those sites. But the risk assessment is done on a reactor-by-reactor basis. So there's no site-wide risk assessment that was done, or is done. What we saw with Fukushima, of course, is that several reactors underwent reactor meltdowns and released radioactivity into the environment, as well did some of the fuel pools or waste pools at the site. I've been doing a lot of work on this at the hearings in recent years, saying that these risk models are wrong and they need to be updated. The CNSC has started to acknowledge this, but this is a big loophole in current regulation that should be addressed. I was just in South Korea, where there's also Canadian reactors, but they also build their reactors in multi-unit sites, just like Japan. So this is something that is an international problem that will need to be looked at, and despite 40 years of reactor operation, this has always been overlooked. So again, the experts got it wrong. Next slide. And finally, implications for nuclear safety. On quotes on screen, you'll see a quote from Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and she used to be pro-nuclear with the Conservative Party. And then when Fukushima happened, she acknowledged, she's also a scientist, that this has changed the way the Germans will do risk assessment, and now the way they're looking at it is their conclusion was they should simply be getting out of nuclear industry production altogether, because the models are flawed and it's not an acceptable risk for German society. Our government officials haven't come to the same conclusion yet, unfortunately. Next slide. So to conclude, I've been talking at you for quite a while now. Some suggested responses. So I've run you through the industry's overall approach to risk, how they develop or justify what is a reasonable risk. This is what they deem as safe. But there's a lot of holes in that I've outlined. They don't consider a lot of issues that are important to the public. And so my suggestion to you, if you're ever intervening in a licensing process, whether it's for a reactor or a radioactive waste facility, is to look for a few things. One, try to understand and then challenge the bounding assumptions. So what were the assumptions they used to exclude from the licensing or environmental review the consideration of large accidents or major accidents. You need to search that out. It'll be buried, devil is in the details, but it's very important for understanding how they're justifying this exclusion. Highlight the lack of empirical support for their assumptions. Note all the numbers that I've been using in this presentation today are ridiculous. The industry talks about 1 in a million years of reactor operations. They've been doing that since the 1950s. No one has ever run a reactor for 1 million years. They don't have any empirical basis for this. And indeed, what we're seeing through real-world experience is that accidents are happening much more often. They're not integrating that into their models. The same goes for radioactive waste sites. They are talking about facilities that will need to be around and protect the public for 1 million years. They don't have a good empirical basis for this. Third, regulatory capture is a key contributor to nuclear risk. This is not considered in their modeling. It is a big vulnerability. This came up a lot at the hearings on the proposed low and medium level waste facility and should be considered. So that's something that they usually don't talk about. Bring it up. And finally, has the CNSC considered what society and not nuclear experts consider as reasonable or unreasonable? The answer to this almost always is no. So you have a right to say, I disagree with your assumption of reasonable. This is an unreasonable risk to society. That will put them a little more on the defensive. And finally, talk about a precautionary approach to risk assessment. The nuclear industry would have never started if they had been using the precautionary principle because of all the uncertainties and for the possibility of substantial harm to the environment. So bring up that approach to risk assessment. They don't use it, and it's something that modern risk assessments dealing with environmental issues do use. So with that, do I have any other slides, Brene? I think I'm done.